On September 8, 1945, Lieutenant Henry Hank Blake, the skipper of PT-375, led the 4 Japanese surrender delegation members to an open space on the forward deck, where they could be closely observed for any indications of betrayal. The top Japanese official in Borneo, Vice Admiral Michiaki Kamada of the Imperial Japanese Navy, started walking toward the location with 2 other Japanese officers. The 4th Japanese was a big, stocky, enlisted guy who positioned himself near the cockpit of PT-375, essentially sandwiched between the other 3 Japanese and the American sailors. Hank, a tough PT boat captain and former collegiate wrestling champion, confronted the burly man who appeared to be the Japanese official's bodyguard. Hank recounts, he was treating the officers like a bunch of chickens, stopping them at certain points and taking half steps. That was not going to happen to me, so I shouted, "Hey buddy, it's going overboard, so get your ass up on the bow, now, or else you're going too far. It's Spaview." Regardless of his proficiency in English, the Japanese bodyguard grasped the essence of Hank's caution and promptly advanced to join the other 3 surrender party members. "We watched them closely," Hank explained, "but they didn't bother us after that." The climax of Hank Blake's PT boat career during World War II was PT-375's taxi mission, which took place 6 days after the official Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay. How did the 25-year-old Pennsylvania native wind up off the coast of Borneo armed and carrying 3,000 gallons of 100-octane aviation gasoline? A future naval officer. Hank said, "I always loved the water, just loved the water. My brother, Dad, and I used to reside in a small, furnished apartment in Albany, New York. During our visit, the Hudson River was dredged to allow ocean-going ships to reach Albany." How strong was the sea's grip on Hank's susceptible mind, given the large ships that came and went from his hometown? He clarified, "My mother wanted to make sure I got the right religious training when I was just a kid. So, after giving me a nickel for spending money, she would push me out the door and send me to a Baptist church a block away. However, I would take that cent, purchase a bag of peanuts, and head to the waterfront. To be near the sea, I would give the birds peanuts. I wanted to join the Navy because I simply adored the water." After Hank contracted the sea bug, it was obvious which branch of the military he would be entering when the U.S. entered World War II. He chose to enlist 3 months after the Pearl Harbor assault, forgoing his graduation from Lock Haven State Teachers College, now Lock Haven University. Hank stated, "I had enough credit hours to earn my degree, and I graduated cum laude, but leaving college early meant I was going to miss the graduation ceremony. After completing my basic training and induction in March 1942, I was posted to Columbia University's Midshipmen's School in New York City. I was given the responsibility of teaching drill, swimming, basic boat handling, and physical training, because I had a bachelor's degree in health and physical education from Lock Haven. Because I adore the water, teaching swimming was a terrific aspect for me." The officer in charge of the program saw Hank's aptitude in the water and allowed him complete freedom to create the swimming program. They asked me to go swimming with this one platoon for fun. 30% of the 36 men I believe I had in there were incapable of swimming a whole length of a pool, yet they were to become naval commanders. So I immediately got active, scouted other swimming facilities around Columbia University, and recruited the assistance of other guys who were as good at swimming as I was. In addition to teaching recreational swimming, we also covered how to conduct a rescue and evacuation in the water. Once you are tossed into the water, there are numerous ways to keep afloat with life-saving gear. The commanding officer took note of Hank's initiative and organizational ability, which were crucial during the war, and his swimming program for the midshipmen highlighted these qualities. Hank went on, the CO, I can't recall his name, but he was a commander in rank, said, "You have officer quality, based on the caliber of the swimming program. Would you be open to a commission?" I was married and had a single child at the time, so I was content with my circumstances. However, the more I considered it. Hank gave the opportunity to join the U.S. Naval Reserve as an officer careful thought. When the commander delivered me the letter of reference he had written for me, he added, "You will have gold braid hanging from you the day you desire to become an officer. I then left the physical fitness program and entered officer training as a result. On-board PT boat service. Hank found the idea of becoming a Navy officer to be fascinating and thrilling, but the initial schoolwork was everything but. It was pretty dull, since, as Hank noted, I was then going to classrooms that I had previously taught. In any case, I eventually completed my officer training program. I requested PT boat service at that point. What made him select the PTs? Oh, the sheer thrill of it, he said. I had participated in football, wrestling, and athletics while I was in school. I enjoyed the thrill. I enjoyed fighting. Many of the All-American football players I met in college also joined the PTs. I was certain that I didn't want to board a boat that goes out and modifies buoy marks in a harbor or something similar. I applied for PT duty because I wanted to be involved, and I was granted it. If Hank's justification for selecting the PTs comes across as a little gung-ho, it's because he was. This aggressive can-do attitude was exactly what the U.S. when selecting applicants for command of motor torpedo boats. With a small crew of 14 to 17 men under command, life on a PT boat during a war might be dangerous. Therefore, setting an example and being prepared to take the conflict to the enemy head-on were essential qualities for a successful PT boat commander. Acquiring knowledge of PT boats. After Hank was informed that he had been accepted into the Navy's motor torpedo boat program, it was time to head to the MTB school in Melville, Rhode Island. There wasn't much accommodation available, as was the case in many adjacent cities and villages with a significant military presence. We resided in a one-room apartment in Newport when I relocated my family there. Everyone was packed after all, he recalled. We had one of the building's second-floor rooms. With my training, I could only make it home every third night, even though Melville was just up the river from Newport. Hank was occupied with the many classes offered at the academy, including ones on boat management, navigation, gunnery, engine repair, and torpedo maintenance. Although he performed well in every subject, one in particular stood out. Hank remembered, many of my classmates were assigned to overseas boats immediately after our training was over. However, I was reassigned to Unit 4, which was the Melville-based training unit. At the time, I was 24 years old and taught a variety of courses, including some radar tracking experiments. However, I was quickly transferred to boat handling. I had a genuine flair for it and was quite good at it. I was a natural at managing boats. I therefore endured that for a while. One of the reasons Hank didn't return home to his family's one-room apartment every night was because he was spending the night at sea. A trip from Melville to Bayonne, New Jersey, where Elco was building the boats, was part of the thorough training of new recruits, Hank stated. These excursions served to familiarize the rookies with nighttime travel and long-distance navigation using the PT. The recruits learned a lot from going at night, and we came across a variety of lights, buoys, and signals along the way. They were able to watch the building of new boats after we arrived in Bayonne. Hank kept teaching boat handling until he was put in charge of a Newport boat as the second officer. He was essentially a second officer who did most of the boat labor because his skipper was frequently absent. After a certain amount of time, I received notification to report to Foreign Service and was instructed to go from Newport to San Francisco in order to ship out. On December 29, 1944, after spending Christmas with my family at home, I was ordered to transfer from Squadron 4 to Squadron 27. Arriving in the Pacific with Squadron 27. In January 1945, Hank departed for the Philippines' Subic Bay. He sailed out aboard a repurposed cruise ship with few sailors and many soldiers. On our way across the Pacific, we visited some of the larger islands. After that, we went to the Leyte Gulf and finally to Subic, where I joined Squadron 27. Lieutenant CMDR, Henry Stilley. Taylor, a veteran of the early PT boat engagements in the Solomon Islands, commanded Squadron 27 at the time Hank arrived. When the boats idled into the motor torpedo boat base on Treasury Island off the coast of Bougainville in May 1944, Ron 27, the PT sailors called a Squadron Ron, had already reached the South Pacific. Ron 27 fought the Japanese in the waters surrounding the islands of Bougainville, New Ireland, and New Guinea for the course of the following 2 months. After moving to Palau and the Mariana Islands in August 1944. The squadron was ordered to proceed to the Philippines in late December 1944. At San Pedro Bay and Subic Bay, RON 27, which included PT-356, PT-357, PT-358, PT-359, PT-360, PT-361, PT-372, PT-373, PT-374, PT-375, PT-376, and PT-377 saw action as the boats engaged a number of enemy warships and shore objectives. RON 27 moved in after Subic cleared. Subic Bay was once a Navy coaling facility, according to Hank. When the Navy used steamships instead of oil-fired vessels, they needed to have places all around the world where the ships could get coal to fuel, and Subic was one. If we couldn't nest next to our tender, our boats would occasionally tie up to the former coaling dock. Soon after Hank arrived in Subic Bay, an increasingly rare occurrence in the southwest region of Luzon took place. As much as the U.S., although pilots from the Army Air Forces and Navy had achieved air superiority over the Philippines, air raids continued to occur occasionally. Hank remarked, "I remember almost the first night, or close to it. We went to the general quarters when there was a red alarm. This P-38 sailed right up the shaft of light and captured a Japanese bomber sailing past, who was being illuminated by a massive searchlight on shore. I will never forget that." On February 3, 1945, RON 27's PTs became the first Allied warships to enter Manila Bay since the U.S. forces' capitulation on Corregidor in May 1942. The boats patrolled south from Subic to the waters outside Manila Bay. PT-375. PT-375, an 80-foot Elco vessel put into service on August 10, 1943, was assigned to Hank's crew. Lieutenant Patrick Requa commanded PT-375 at the time of Hank's assignment. We conducted nocturnal patrols, cruises, and other activities in the Manila Bay and Corregidor areas when I was riding second officer, according to Hank. At the time, he was assigned to a boat that already had an executive officer and skipper. We operated out of Manila Bay as soon as it was clear. The surrounding jungle on the big island of Luzon was not entirely free of enemy personnel, despite the fact that the bay was under American control. In the waters offshore, Japanese soldiers were frequently seen trying to flee from Corregidor and the shoreline around Manila Bay. According to the deck log for PT-375, a Japanese soldier was trapped in the screws of the ship in March 1945 while it was returning from a nocturnal patrol. Body pieces were seen in the wake of the boat. According to another record, 5 Japanese soldiers were spotted in the sea while on a different patrol and were eliminated to ensure the safety of the boat when they refused to surrender. Hank also remembered seeing Japanese trying to swim out to sea in an attempt to escape the bay region. There wasn't much vegetation surrounding Corregidor. It was just a large, massive rock. The Japanese would swim out toward Corregidor after emerging from the jungle surrounding Manila Bay. There wasn't really anywhere to hide if they got there. Once on shore, they would just maintain a low profile. Additionally, there was a specific location close to the bay entrance where a radio antenna tower was situated atop a big boulder, roughly the size of a vehicle. Some Japanese would swim out into the water after emerging from the bush, and if they weren't captured by a Japanese submarine or whatever, they would climb that antenna pole after getting atop that rock and having nowhere to hide. Where in hell did they think they were going? I have no idea. However, a few of them were captured from that rock. In the vicinity of the several sunken ships scattered around Manila Bay, RON 27's patrols also captured detainees. Japanese snipers would clamber aboard the hulks in small groups and use the wrecks as cover to shoot any Americans who happened to be in the area. PT-375 would alternately fire runs on the ships with other PT boats, noting in the logbook whether the run was positive or negative. Blood was seen in the water, or Japanese bodies were visible. A close call with shrapnel for a crew member. However, targets of all kinds decreased as the Americans advanced deeper into the island of Luzon, so the PT crews focused on other assignments. By this point in the conflict, Hank observed, it was clear that gunnery was much more important than torpedoes. This emphasis on the PT's principal function as a gunboat was furthered by frequent runs out to sea for gunnery practice against floating and flying targets. Hank remembers one specific encounter during his time on PT-375 when all attacks were conducted using firearms. I served as the executive officer for Pat Requa. We fought the enemy in a nocturnal operation with total blackness. Requa was in charge of one of the twin .40 caliber machine guns next to the cockpit while I was behind the wheel. Shrapnel was flying everywhere. I noticed a tear in Pat's uniform knee despite the fact that we were in a blackout. "We are going below to examine your knee," I said to Pat, putting an enlisted guy behind the wheel. Pat's voice was quite worried since he knew he was heading home to get married, and he said, "The hell with my knee? I think my dick is gone." As we descended into the light, it became clear that a fragment of shrapnel had entered his fly's top in a straight downward trajectory, resulting in merely a blood blister at the location where his penis was connected to his trunk. A second piece of shrapnel had injured his leg, causing the most of the bleeding. Over his shoe, blood was dripping out. As Hank returned to the wheel and radioed the location of the closest hospital ship, Requa personally directed medical attention to his wound. He was able to get the boat moving at full speed right away after setting it on a path to the ship. After dropping Pat out at the hospital ship, we went back to work. The shrapnel's trajectory amused the boat's crew for a long time because he was scheduled to return home to get married. Taking care of the PT. In order to train for patrols supporting the impending invasion of Borneo, Squadron 27's boats were moved to the southern Philippine island of Samar in June 1945. The boat's hull was cleaned and painted as part of the preparations, Hank stated. The USS Varuna, an LST landing ship tank that was converted to PT tender status, was sent to our squadron. We were lifted out of the water to service the boat's bottom, and it had a cradle, sometimes called a A-frame, that the boat could float onto. On the tender, you were allotted several hours to remove the enormous growth that the ocean had created on the hull's bottom. Unchecked growth would cause enough drag on the PT's sleek hull to drastically lower the boat's top speed. Since speed was one of the PT's main advantages, a clean hull was crucial to the success of the mission, as well as the crew's and the boat's safety. Following a new layer of camouflage paint, PT-375 was sent out to sea for additional testing. We went out and ran the boats at different speeds, tested our gunfire, and tested the accuracy of our navigating equipment, Hank recalled. I got them ready for the Borneo move. Hank had a shift in responsibility at this point. I became the skipper of PT-375 at Samar. For a brief time, there would be 3 officers on a boat when the Navy brought in an ensign to train. The XO would be promoted to captain, the top officer would return home, and the third officer would take over as executive officer as soon as they believed the officer was suitable. When we were stationed at Samar, I was promoted to boat captain in this manner. After Pat Requa received orders to return to the United States, I was placed as second in charge. Additionally, the Navy would send us children who were just 16 or 17 years old and had never left their homes. The crew would place the letters on my desk, since an officer would have to censor them when they were written. One child from New Jersey wrote home numerous letters because he was so thrilled to be on a boat. Now, on a PT, you had all of these enlisted men shaving and using the restroom with one head at the bow of the boat. It might get really messy because there were several men using a single stainless steel sink and toilet in a small, confined space. Everyone had to take a turn cleaning the enlisted men's heads, even though it was the most repulsive task on the boat. I immediately placed this New Jersey lad on there to break him in, and he did an amazing job. I placed him there, and I must say that after he had finished cleaning it, that head looked like a jewelry store. He responded, "Well, nobody is taking it from me," when I pulled him up in front of the other crew members, gave him praise, shook his hand, placed my arm around his shoulder, and added, "We just haven't had anybody that liked that job." He gave himself the task. You should have seen how he boasted to his family about becoming captain of the head when I censored his subsequent letter home. Hank and PT-375 left for the final significant Allied invasion of World War II, the assault of Borneo, shortly after he was promoted to captain. Endorsing the Borneo invasion. Australian forces waded ashore on July 1, 1945, marking the start of the assault's ground phase. On June 27th, before the invasion, 4 PTs of RON-27 landed in the region in response to the Australians' requests for U.S. naval support for the operation. On the day of the assault, the remaining 8 boats joined the USS Varuna. When the Australians advanced further inside on Borneo, the PTs relocated to the island itself to better offer efficient close-in support. At first, the boats operated out of adjacent Tarakan. According to Hank, the entire squadron was assigned to a base at Balikpapan. From there, we patrolled the coastline and nearby islands at night. Preventing the Japanese from supplying and rescuing some of their legions in the region was the tactic at that point in the conflict. It was our responsibility to stop all enemy travel, day or night, and to destroy weapons that were positioned on nearby islands and along the coast. If a Japanese radio station or other facility needed to be removed, we were given precise instructions. Additionally, it was clear that the Japanese were providing the local inhabitants on the islands with weapons, and the PT squadrons were tasked with stopping this commerce. Instead of torpedo boats, these were gunboats. We conducted almost all of our work at night and conducted many raids. The Japanese occasionally tried to provide weapons via surface ships and submarines. We would come across tiny Japanese vessels known as maru, which we would refer to as snafu maru. In an effort to get to or from the islands, the Japanese used a variety of small vessels, including lighters, luggers, and canoes. However, PT-375 and the other PTs tightened their grip around Borneo, choking off anything that floated. The PTs were successful in limiting the amount of supplies sent to the Japanese on Borneo and preventing the escape or evacuation of the besieged enemy personnel, as had happened elsewhere in the Pacific over the preceding 3 years of fighting. Hank also attributed the Allies' success there to the soldiers on shore. The Australian land forces provided a very important element of this containment, he said, allowing the PT to roar. The United States and Australia collaborated operationally on numerous times during the Borneo War, coordinating Australian air, ground, and naval support with the U.S. naval forces. The PTs began searching for enemy objectives elsewhere as the Japanese resistance on Borneo gradually weakened. Hank clarified, "We would travel to the Celebes Islands from our base in Borneo to clean up some items the command wanted removed. They dispatched a fleet officer to accompany me on one of my daylight patrols. He was far higher in rank than I was as a lieutenant, but I'm not sure exactly what that is. In any case, he boarded my boat and informed me that a Japanese floatplane installation was situated somewhere on one of these tiny islands. Since the floatplanes would fly so high that they couldn't be seen or heard, they posed a risk to the PTs. However, they could detect the wake of a PT boat. The Packard engine's exhaust noise was managed using mufflers on the boat. You would roar with the mufflers wide open if you were racing between islands. However, you could drown out all of your sound if you were spying around there at, say, 6 knots. Nevertheless, the boat left a wake, and the Japanese were able to observe PT boat traffic clearly thanks to that wake. So we went out to find potential air stations for these fucking float planes with that fleet officer on board. We knew the Japanese were aware of our presence as we were moving forward, so we simply left the throttles open since we knew we were exposed because it was daylight. It was fine if they wanted to come out and greet us. Whatever the case, we were roaring away when suddenly the boat's rear made this terrible noise. The engine output of these PT boats did not undergo any gear reduction because they were direct drive. Every one of our 3 V12 engines was either moving forward or backwards once it was in gear. We heard a huge scream all of a sudden, and the center shaft, one of the prop shafts, had worn out. The prop was also dropped off when it snapped, allowing the center Packard to run at full speed with no burden at all. Since we still had 2 great Packard engines, we had no issue shutting it down, turning around, and returning to base. We proceeded to our tender, a large, long LST specially outfitted to care for 2 PT squadrons, after I hobbled back into base. During the day, we nested next to the tender. If you were unable to dock on shore, you nested next to the tender's side. After carefully guiding the boat to the tender, I discovered that they lacked a screw and shaft that would work with our other 2. The supply officer on the tender stated, I apologize, but I don't want to send you out with just 2 screws working. The screws were approximately 28 inches wide, and he added, "The only thing I have in stock is a set of racing screws." "Put her on, baby," I said. For me, that was even more advantageous because it undoubtedly made the 375 the squadron's fastest boat. I consequently had certain errands to run when senior officers needed to be transferred between locations or were visiting a particular ship or facility. We therefore worked a little bit as taxi drivers during the day, but at night we were undoubtedly linked up with hits from Borneo or the Celebes Islands. Stormy seas as a threat. Additionally, Hank sent native scouts to shores controlled by the enemy. Hank remembered they were Netherlands East Indies scouts. I sent them ashore to get information about the Japanese. Hank soon discovered that the local islanders did not like their Japanese occupiers, so they decided to run the boat up on the shore and drop them off. He claimed that the Japanese made the locals crouch in their presence. They were unable to endure, but the indigenous peoples of Borneo wouldn't be squatting for long. That really irritated me. Imperial Japan's armies in Borneo and elsewhere were running out of time. Squadron 27's boats faced more than just the Japanese as a threat. The Southwest Pacific's weather presented its own set of difficulties. "There was a time when the weather was awful when we went to attack Borneo," Hank said. "Our squadron reached this location just north and slightly east of the coast of Borneo. There, where we were tethered, we experienced storms every single night. Anyone operating the boat, studying a map, or doing anything similar at the wheel had no place to hide while it was in motion. Because the PT cockpit was exposed to the weather, vision was very good. All hands, however, were completely exposed topside. The sun would be so intense during the day that some of the boats would erect a canvas over the foredeck, resembling an awning," Hank added. "The wind would simply take it and depart if they didn't remove it before a storm arrived." We were accustomed to being in some really deep swells when we were traveling from island to island. I mean, to the point where you would start to climb steeply up the face of the swell. Hank was able to keep on track while navigating through such high seas, because to his prior boat handling knowledge. Hank said, "You would use the wheel to keep the boat headed in the right direction, and you would have a course that was in your mind and set in your compass. These enormous waves would occasionally come one after the other. You would be climbing and climbing until you reached the top, at which point the wave would drop out from behind you and you would slam down. Deals like that have broken legs, knees, elbows, and particularly light bulb filaments. In any case, if you were paying attention, the typical procedure was to reach nearly to the crest of one of these large waves before hurling the boat into a hard rudder. That would cause your ship's head to curve to the right, allowing you to glide down the opposite side of the swell, on your stern, rather of slamming down. Otherwise, it would be like having someone jump behind you when you're on the end of a diving board. You would rudder hard left at the crest of the swell when the next big roller hit, making up for the last hard right you made when you straightened out. The end of the war. Regarding the storms we encountered, I recall that one day, before we left for the night's patrol, a crew member was listening to a baseball game on the radio in the afternoon. We learned that the war was finished. We were asked to run to the Celebes the following day. So, when a terrible storm arose that night, we set out with another boat under Mel Everingham's leadership. What if this storm was at Melville? I asked him over the talk between ships, TBS. What if the weather at Melville is like this? I retorted, so what the hell are we doing out here anyway? He responded, we'd call base, secure from patrol, turn around, and go home. The conflict is over, and he did. We turned around and didn't finish the patrol when he called the base. One of the excellent men was Mel. You know, we didn't have any chicken shit officers. We had practically all nice guys. We immediately began calling him Chick if one was approaching. He was aware that time was running out. The battle was, in fact, over, as Hank's shipmate declared over the radio. Men celebrated in different ways across the Pacific, some loudly and some quietly, just as they had done across Europe when Nazi Germany submitted. What were the actions of Hank and his team? He explains, well, my squadron commander, Stilly Taylor, who was also quite informal, had 12 boats in his squadron. Each boat had around 2 officers and 14 or 15 enlisted men, and he somehow managed to get some cases of cool beer. "You're in charge, Blake," he said as he called me in, adding that you're the only man in the squadron without alcohol. 3 or 4 beer cans are given to each soldier in the squadron, but open them all. Don't share a can with anyone else. I had everything presented out the manner he requested. Each person drank 4 beers. I got more inebriated than a skunk, and there was no gunfire. For a day, Hank was a popular guy since the PT crews undoubtedly welcomed his beer delivery. Additionally, Hank was a by-the-book skipper with his own crew. He had no nicknames, despite the fact that the tiny crews and close quarters of PT service tended to foster informal interactions between officers and enlisted personnel. He stated, "I was either Captain or Mr. Blake. I enforced the rules. However, I would go into the ocean with these men and play king of the raft, throwing the life raft around. We would take it and hurl it overboard. I had great swimming and wrestling skills." Accepting the Japanese surrender, PT-375 was selected to transport the Japanese surrender party on September 8, 1945, for reasons other than the fact that she might have been RON 27's beer delivery vehicle. Her speed led to her selection. She had repeatedly demonstrated that she was the fastest boat in the 2 squadrons assigned to the USS Varuna since the racing screws were installed. "We raced all the time," Hank said. "We would race to see which boat was the fastest every morning after patrol. I was hired to accompany the Japanese to the surrender ceremony because of this." Formal surrenders for the Japanese forces remaining dispersed around the enormous Pacific were required when the Japanese unconditionally surrendered on board the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. Stilley Taylor, the leader of RON 27, led 7 boats, including PT-375, to the Coatai River Delta in Borneo on the morning of September 8, 1945, in order to meet the Japanese surrender team. "Give the bastards a ride," meaning a rough ride, Hank said, after the naval officer in charge of this deal called down and said he wanted the fastest boat to go pick up the Japanese surrender party. That was no longer an issue because the Celebes group, which was many miles away, was nearly always separated from the Borneo coast by a sea at least 5 feet deep. A surge of water flowed through that area and into the oceans beneath Australia. Additionally, we didn't get any instructions to be courteous to the Japanese. We saw 4 Japanese on board the little wooden Australian steamboat that carried them down the river to the delta. 3 officers and a bodyguard. In any case, we had enormous mufflers on the stern, so we never wanted anyone to come from that direction, since you wouldn't be able to mute your midnight patrols if they crashed out on it. As a result, the Australian man in charge of the riverboat came right in and nearly climbed on our mufflers. I told him to move ahead on the bow and waved him away. The Japanese emerged from the riverboat after he turned around, and there was no formality or salute. I was stern with the bodyguard when he began to stall since I wanted them higher up on the bow, but our superiors didn't voice any qualms about it after that. I dropped the Japanese off at the frigate HMAS Burdekin, an Australian warship, and that was that. We were instructed to return our boats to the Philippines for deactivation shortly after that. The sad thing about that was that you knew you were bidding goodbye to your beloved boat. The greatest quality of Hank's PT. Hank had a short tenure with PT-375 following the surrender run. He would never forget her remarkable speed, her sleek hull and racing screws. "Every weapon in the boat worked flawlessly," he said. "There were no significant issues other than losing the center shaft and prop when the crystallized shaft broke. Of course, PT-375 would not have ended up with her racing screws if the shaft had not failed." Hank remembered with nostalgia. Even when fully loaded, she'd get up to full speed pretty damn fast from a speed of 7 or 8 knots. And it sounded like hell broke loose with those Packards running at full speed. The PT-375 was unquestionably a good boat, but given that Hank taught Higgins-built PTs for a large portion of his tenure at Melville as an instructor with Squadron 4, Higgins and Elco were the 2 main producers of PT boats for the U.S. Navy during World War II. It is reasonable to wonder what his favorite feature of the Elco PT boat was. Did the elegant lines do it? The velocity? The ride is drier than the Higgins design. It was far easier for Hank than any of these. They had cubes of ice, he clarified. Cubes of ice? Indeed, the Elco PTs featured tiny freezers in their small galleys, and having ice cubes to cool a drink in the tropical Pacific's heat was a crucial luxury for sailors who didn't have many of these things, as well as a refreshing reminder of home for those serving overseas. PT-375's destiny. Ice cubes and her speed were insufficient to prevent PT-375 from meeting the same end as many other PT boats at the conclusion of the war. Every single knife, fork, and spoon that the Navy could find on board was processed. "Everything is processed," Hank added. They removed the workers once all of that procedure was finished. Now I had a boat with no crew or equipment, just me and another officer. They removed my XO after a few days, and then they removed PT-375 after a few more days. I then proceeded to the temporary officers' quarters. Later on, I found out that they moved the vessels to a shoal off the coast of Samar and burned them, set them on fire. The United States and PT-375. Men like Hank made sure the Navy's more than 500 motor torpedo boats were used to their greatest ability, which helped the country defeat fascism and tyranny during World War II. The boats had served their nation well during a period of extreme risk and hardship. Hank remarked, "I'm incredibly proud that I had the opportunity to do it because it had to be done." During my nearly 4 years in the Navy, I don't recall ever objecting to the tasks I was given. I simply performed what I had to do, finished it, and assumed that eventually I would be able to go back to my life as I had always desired. Thankfully, Hank Blake's situation turned out just that way, thanks in part to PT-375, Borneo's fastest PT boat.